Hello everyone. Welcome to the first session of this reading initiative. Myself, Urmisha Chatterjee, and I am a research fellow in ISI Kolkata. Whatever I'll be presenting today is the basics of deep learning, mostly covering like the foundation of deep learning, the basic ideas, applications, and lastly, we will see two very well-known statistical models. These are very popular in statistics as well as machine learning. We will see how we can represent these models as some very simple deep learning models. So, to start with, deep learning as a subject is a subset of machine learning that is specifically designed to solve complex machine learning problems. Machine learning problems has its applications in diverse areas, and some of the challenging machine learning tasks they are actually solved by deep learning tools such as in speech recognition or language processing or computer vision. In these areas, deep learning model find its major applications. But if deep learning is a part of machine learning, then why do we study deep learning separately than machine learning? See, machine learning is the study of data driven techniques, by techniques using which we teach a machine to learn to do a particular task. We basically feed in data to the machine, which basically using which it trains itself to do a task, and then in future it replicates doing the same task. So the subtle difference between machine learning and deep learning is in the type of models. In traditional machine learning, the models are simple models with simple models doing limited tasks, whereas in deep learning the models are quite deep, involving layers of computation, and thereby it can do a large number of tasks by itself. And all the difference in these two aspects mostly comes from this major fundamental difference. See, simple models, as they do limited tasks, it also takes as input very limited features from the data. Now, in real life, we know data is not so simple. Real life data can be anything. It can be an image file, audio file, text file, anything. So, for traditional machine learning model, we have to simplify the required features. We have to extract them from the complex data, feed it into the system. But in deep learning, we don't have to do this such manual feature extraction. They can handle complex data structure, so we can directly feed in our raw data into the deep learning models. And similarly, as machine learning models, the models are simple. It has lesser number of parameters, so it can be easily trained on small data sets as compared to deep learning models. As the models are complex, it involves lots of parameters, and that also requires a lot of data for training. So as you can see, the data is where it makes the difference, and data is the central theme for any sort of machine learning. So the storage of data is actually what gave rise to the deep learning ideas and its development. In recent times, storage of large amount of data has been cheaper, and the storage capacity, I'll say, has increased exponentially. And as we can store large amount of data, and that actually led the scientists to wonder how to analyze these large informations, because large data set means huge information, and how we can analyze lots of information at the same time. And that gave rise to several complex deep learning models. As you can see in this table, in 1936, the IRIS dataset was published. It's very popular among statisticians. We all have used it in modeling or in exploratory analysis. It's a very small size data of 5 KB. And then in 1998, you see the MNIST dataset. It is actually a image dataset uh, yeah, of handwritten digits. So this dataset is quite popular for implementing image classification models. So it is of size 11 megabytes, but then in within 11 years you can see the rise in data storage capacity. The ImageNet dataset that was published in 2009, it's in gigabytes. So this is also an image data database, mostly used for training the image classification models. And in recent times, we have data sets of in terabytes, hundreds of terabytes. The Leon data set. It is also on image text. I mean, it is image text paired data. Also has a similar application. So these are open source databases. Anybody who is learning, I mean, wants to want to learn image processing or implement some sort of algorithms related to image classification, they can use data from these data sets. So, having said a little bit on deep learning, I will focus on two of the chapters from the book that we are reading in this session. So, chapter one, which is applications of deep learning, and chapter two, it is actually chapter three in the original book as linear neural networks. Now, I have skipped chapter two purposefully because chapter two is on preliminaries, mostly consisting of the mathematical ideas, very basic ones, graduation level, and but the coding part that it has from Python, that is very relevant, as in the following chapter, starting from chapter 3, they do the like every modeling model that they have described, they have implemented it on a data set, and that too from scratch. So understanding the codes in the preliminaries is important to follow the coding in the next chapters. Okay, so in the first chapter, mostly we will discuss some of the applications of deep learning. And as deep learning is a part of machine learning, so we will be mostly discussing the machine learning problems. So whenever we have a machine learning problem, we classify it into one of these classes: supervised learning, unsupervised learning, or reinforcement learning. The reason for classification is that once we have classified our problem into one of these classes, it helps to search for the tools that we need to solve our problem in hand. So let us have a look at them one by one. Supervised learning. Supervised learning is the most controlled way of learning, or the controlled way of training. Here the task is very simple. We will have something, maybe a variable or maybe some abstract object that is labeled as target, and our purpose is we just have to predict the target from the inputs. What do I mean by that? uh, like suppose we want to predict the sale of second hand cars, sale price of second hand cars based on their age, model, gear type, these kind of informations, or predicting price of a stock next month based on current month's financial reporting data. So these are some supervised learning problems. So for training, as we saw that we need data. For supervised learning problem, our data set includes of input-output pairs, xi, yi. These are conventional notations. X for the input that it takes, input or features. These terms are most common with machine learning practitioners, whereas statisticians prefer covariates, independent variables, calling it. And yi, they are called the output or target in machine learning, and mostly statisticians call it response or dependent variable. And given our data, the goal is that we want to produce a model. Mathematically, we can represent it by a function f theta, which will take as input the inputs or features x, and will give us a prediction of the output as f theta x. Now there are actually various types of supervised learning problems, and the complexity actually depends on what is the input and output type. If they are very simple, like numerical variables or categorical variables, our traditional machine learning methods uh, are enough to solve our problems. So the very basic example is predicting temperature on the next day based on humidity, wind speed, and atmospheric pressure. Here, the output is numerical, that is the temperature, and inputs, they are also numerical variables. So you can use any traditional like linear regression or polynomial regression in this problem. Another example could be predicting a medical expense bill. A person visits with some illness uh, and also some particular physical characteristic, and you want to predict what will be the medical expense. Hospital might be interested in that. So these are some very simple supervised learning problems, and here the target and the input, they are very clear, and it can be easily solved by simple machine learning methods. But what about this problem that suppose someone wants to predict the exact age of a person using high resolution images of human faces? So in that case, our input variable is images. uh, I, I mean, human faces. Don't go into that cartoon face image that I have on the presentation. Is just for distraction. So the input is actually images, and you can see high resolution images can be around 256 by 256 pixels RGB images. So in each pixel, we will have three values corresponding to the three colors aspect, and this is the actual raw data for the input. We can forcibly vectorize it so that our input becomes a mathematical variable. We can indeed do that. In that case, we will have total 256 square pixels, and in each pixel we have three values. So by vectorization, we will have 256 square times 3 is equal to an input feature vector of 1,96,608 variables, quite large. And using a classical machine learning method here can be problematic, because this many features means even at very simple models like any linear model, we will have this many, like 1,96,608 many parameters, and then estimating them all will require lots of data. Probably we will have 10,000 to 20,000 images, so there will be the problem of overfitting. So in these cases, traditional machine learning methods are not encouraged. Mostly the most widely used method is the convolutional neural network. This type of deep learning methods, they can take the entire raw image as input. As we will proceed in our reading sessions, we will also be learning about this method. Another complex problem could be predicting the calories burned by human using motion videos. So suppose if there is an fitness tracker app, the user it just uploads a video or just records it live, a live video of exercising, and the purpose of the app is to count how many calories he or she has burned. So here the output is numerical, but the input here is video file. And video file is like a continuous image. We can discretize it as image frames, say 30 frames per second. So if it's a 10-second video, we will have 300 RGB images, and this is just for one instance of our training data set, 300 RGB images. Obviously this is even more complex than the last problem we saw. And for such complex problems, there are deep models such as 3D CNNs or transformers widely used for solving these tasks. Besides regression, there is actually even more applications in classification. For classification, our target variable is a categorical variable. That means in our for our target variable, we have a set of classes or categories, and our target is to predict one category for given the input. For example, if predicting if a student passes or fails in an exam based on our study number of practice tests taken. So here the output is we have to predict either the student passes or it fails, and our inputs are our studied number of practice tests taken. This is a binary classification problem, and there are standard methods to solve it. Easy problem. Another problem could be predicting the type of wine based on its chemical properties like acidity, alcohol content, this type. And the output is the set of categories is class 1, class 2, class 3. So this is a multi-class classification problem. Now, in classification, the main purpose, although, is we have to predict a particular category, but modeling exactly this purpose is a little difficult and inappropriate. So, instead of predicting a particular category, what the modeling involves is assigning probability to each category. That means, given the input, what I try to model is what is the probability the student will pass, or what is the probability he will fail. Similarly, for multi-class, given the chemical properties of wine, we want to find what is the probability that it is a wine of class 2 or class 3. So these are some simple problems. Again, Some complex problem under classification could be classifying images of handwritten digits. Again, the same problem. The inputs are no more numerical variables but some images. Another could be predicting if a mushroom is poisonous based on an image. That suppose there is an app for the mushroom lovers. So the mushroom lover will click picture of a particular type mushroom, and the app will decide whether he can eat it or not. These kind of applications. So here the output is either poisonous or not poisonous. These are some standard classification problems, but then there are some particular classification problems which do not exactly follow the definition as being a classification problem, but although can be considered as classification problems, such as tagging. Tagging means when our target variable can in target variable we don't predict an exact category as the predicted category, but there can be multiple categories assigned. Uh, this type of problem is called the multi-level classification. Note there is a difference between them. In multi-class, we the set of classes is more than two, and in multi-level classification, we can actually assign more than one class as our predicted output variable. Examples could be tags of an article. This is very popular in library sciences. uh, that you want to classify one article into categories. Now a particular scientific article could be under the category of machine learning, also it could be under the category of programming. In this way it can have multiple categories, and the reviewer has to assign tags accordingly. For
The I would like I
Yeah,
have a question. Can I
yes,
ask over here?
sure.
Yeah, thanks. So like before that we were discussing multi-class classification, and like I'm just
Yeah.
trying to understand that my understanding of tagging is correct. That
Mhm.
here we are predicting like is it like we are predicting a dynamic number of output variables, like for instance the picture can have many animals, and in that case all the names would be displayed as the output. Is it something like that, or
Right,
is it
right.
something else?
Yeah, I mean the length of the output here is not fixed actually. Like it could be like in the second example, like identifying all animals. Here even if you look at the set of categories, that is also even not fixed, so that is dynamic. But then in the tags of an article, that actually has a limited numbers, but you don't know what will be the length of the output, but it's fixed at most, the at most part.
Okay, got it, thanks.
Okay. So besides tagging, there is ranking. And ranking means is that you not only the target variable not only assigns a number of categories, but it also assigns the categories in an ordered fashion. You have to assign ranks to the categories. The most common example is web page ranking. Whenever we entered a query into anywhere like Google or any browser, we get the web pages related to our query, and the web pages are actually ranked. The most relevant ones comes first and followed by the rest relevant ones. So this is a very classic example where they categorize the web pages and then rank them. Another problem is recommender system. Recommender system is very similar to multi-level classification, but there is the difference in the sense that there is an order of relevancy. Like you display multiple labels but on a relevant fashion. For example, movie recommendation. This is very widely used by Amazon and YouTube. They recommend based on their users age, gender, or genre choice. They recommend a list of movies. Beside these two, there is another very interesting classification problem, which is sequence learning. In sequence learning, the uncertainty is at its peak. Here, either the inputs or the output, there could there could be that it is not of fixed length, either the input or the output, or it could be both. For example, sentiment analysis. See, sentiment analysis, suppose there is a company and it wants to see how what are its customers complaints and want to improve accordingly. So suppose each day it receives thousands of reviews, and the company wants to find which are the negative reviews and have a look at them. So it needs to classify if, the reviews as being negative reviews and positive reviews. So that's classification in that sense. But here, see the input is text. So, and now text file, text can be of any length. So the input has no fixed length in this sense. Another problem could be speech recognition, where we receive a speech and the output is a text. Here, see the input, which is an audio file, the speech. It can be in a one-dimensional waveform that looks like a time series curve, but that is also not a fixed length. It can be a speech of even a 1 minute length speech. So the input is not fixed, and so is the output. That output length will also depend on the input length. So these are some classification problems. With this, we have covered the supervised learning problems. Moving on to our next segment, unsupervised learning problems. Now, unsupervised learning problems are a little less control type of problems. Here, you are doing something, but you don't have a fixed target like the supervised learning. You suspect that there is some structure or pattern in the data, and you start looking for it. It has no labeled output. So unsupervised tasks mostly include clustering, grouping your data. You suspect there is the similar data points, you will group into clusters. Dimensionality reduction, compression of data. That means maybe with a lesser number of features, you have 10,000 features, you can express your data with maybe hundreds of features. You expect there is a possibility and you follow that task. And then again, the third one is anomaly detection. That is also same. You suspect that there are some outliers, anomalous observations, and you go looking for it. Some super unsupervised learning problems, grouping handwritten digit images. Here we have input is only input, which is images, and I'm saying that they are not labeled. We just group them so that the images that has same digits, they get grouped together. Another example is in language processing. In language processing, each words are called tokens in language processing terms. So each words are represented by a one hot encoded vector based on the vocabulary size. If the vocabulary size is 10,000, then if each word will be represented by a 10,000 dimensional vector. So if cat is the word occurring at the 900th position in the vocabulary, then it's uh, one hot encoded vector will have a 1 in that position, and rest of them are zeros. So quite large vectors to represent each of the words, especially when the vocabulary size is large. What embeddings does is it tries to find out if each word can be represented in a smaller dimension, maybe assigning non-zero values to the other dimension, to most of the dimension, not like all are zeros, one is one, only one place has one, not in this way, but smaller values to all. This type of word embeddings actually helps to identify semantic relationships, in the sense that if two vectors are closer, I mean their word embedding vectors are closer, then they are of similar meaning. These type of tasks, it also helps to compress our data and also to find out relationship between several words. This is very extremely important in language processing. And to just compress the data to perform these word embeddings, this is an unsupervised learning task, and it is actually an example of dimension reduction. Coming to our last class of machine learning problems, reinforcement learning. This is somehow different than the first two, in the sense that here doing a task is not once, but it has to be done repeatedly. It is a type of machine learning that makes decision by interacting with an environment. So it takes a decision, interacts with the environment. In environment takes some happens something happens in the environment, and then the reinforcement agent has to take another decision. So this is a continuous process. As there is continuous decision the agent has to make, the training of these models, this also goes on continuously, continuous interaction with the environment. And its training involves by through reward and penalties. Whenever it takes a correct decision, it gets a reward. If it's a wrong decision, it gets a penalty. And by this trade off, it learns to take better decisions in future. In this diagram, the mechanism is summarized. Like there is an agent, so the agent, and there is environment. So the agent takes an action, it has some consequences on the environment. Because of that action, there is some the environment will, based on the environment will have some action again, reaction to it, that will generate a reward. Maybe it's a reward or a penalty. The agent takes that as an input, and again, because of that action triggers an observation in the environment, which also the agent takes as input, and then it decides its next action. This is the overall mechanism that continues. The major type of reinforcement learning problem is designing playing bots. So these playing bots, they can actually play various types of games, such as chess. Alpha Zero can play really good chess, even can defeat sharp chess players. Other applications include Robotarm. Robotarm can learn to do human activities such as picking up or placing an object. Or lastly, self-driving cars. They just making a car to learn to stay in lanes whenever, even if the driver is not aware, or maybe avoid collisions. This type of thing. So with this, we cover the applications of deep learning in almost all the segments of machine learning problems. Now, before I move on to the third chapter on linear neural networks, I will like to ask if anyone has any questions. I am connected.
Yeah, so
Yes,
I
I have a yes,
yeah,
Pratik,
Yeah.
Pranjali,
continue.
go ahead.
Okay. So I have a question from the last slide from the
Hmm.
reinforcement learning, that what is the difference between the reward or penalty and the observation that the environment is generating? Like how the
See,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, so like how the reward and observation are different. That is the question.
I mean, whenever there is a reward, uh, the agent has taken an action, and because of that, the consequences of that action in the environment will generate a reward. So, if it's a correct action, it will be a reward. If it's not a bad action, then it will be some penalty, and accordingly, it will put weights. The agent will change its weight. Like if that was a correct action, then it will put a higher weight to that action whenever it is taking decision in the next step. If it's a penalty, it will assign a smaller weights to that particular action.
Okay, okay. Got it. Thank you.
Anything else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you give an example regarding reinforcement learning about the
Mhm.
reward penalties and these observations?
Mm, you can consider any, two-player game if you are playing, where there is some score assignment. Like in every decision you take, uh, there is a score
So, like,
assignment.
I am the agent and I am taking an action like that.
Yes. Now, suppose there is a computer or the reinforcement learning agent who is playing with a human. So the reinforcement learning is one move, then there is another move from the human,
Okay,
like
okay.
that.
So, it's like a game. I mean, if I input something, then someone will give us the right move or the wrong move. It will tell me, and I so that I can observe from that.
Yeah, right.
Okay, okay.
I think this is a very simple way to put the concept of reinforcement learning, but I think when we will learn this modeling, it will be more complex to practical application. This is just a rough idea how it works.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, so I had a question which is motivated to understand the intuition behind how the training of a deep learning model works. So earlier you were describing machine learning and deep learning. Machine learning, like linear regression, I think most of us have a good enough intuition that there is an objective function, error sum of squares, or L2 penalty, which is being minimized, and as a consequence of that minimization I am getting some parameters for my regression line, the slope and the intercept.
Right.
But what what is happening in deep learning, it's also probably optimizing something, but like intuitively what is happening over there in terms of the optimization, I wanted you to comment on that.
In terms of optimization, we will have, if it's a regression problem, we can use similar loss function. There, I don't think that there will be any difference in that aspect. Yes, the squared error loss function in terms of the parameter will look different, but the loss function will remain same if we are using a deep learning model for a regression problem as well. But like if it's a neural network with lots of hidden layers, lots of parameters, uh, optimizing it is obviously not what we do by hand, but the loss function will look similar. Optimization process is same.
Okay, so the difference actually comes in the number of optimizations that have to be made.
Right. The loss function in terms of the model parameter is extremely complex.
Okay, thanks.
So if anyone else has any question, not then I'll continue. Okay. I think there is it. So the most first model, whenever we say deep learning, is neural networks. And this is where we start with our understanding the deep learning models. Neural network is one of the fundamental deep learning model, and what we will see today is two standard statistical methods models. These are traditional machine learning models that can be represented as simple neural networks. They are linear regression and softmax regression. Softmax regression is the name quite popular in machine learning textbooks, but it is actually in the context of statistics, it's called the multinomial classification or multinomial logistic regression. So linear regression, there is nothing to describe. It is the most simplest model. We know that we have some independent variables x, and our target variable is y. We want to find what is the value of the target variable on an average. For example, finding the average height, that will be weight, average weight of a 5 foot tall boy. Now, in probabilistic term, uh, we can consider this input and output as random variables. So we what we are trying to model here is the conditional expectation of modeling y given x. This is what we want to model as a function of the input x. In linear regression, we just assume that this function is a linear function of x. So if there are actually, we have data from p variables, then x is actually a p vector, and then our target is the weighted sum plus a bias term, which we can represent using vector notations and x transpose w plus p. There is one thing I would like to note, that whenever there is a vector, as we will be doing a lot of mathematics from here, so I have denoted all the vectors in boldface. So there are p many vectors, so and there are p many weights assigned to it, plus there is a bias term. We can obviously just represent everything using x transpose w as well, because we just have to consider there is another variable that takes the value 1 always, and its corresponding weight is b. Okay, so for linear regression, our data set, it looks like input output pairs. There are n observations, you can call them instances or examples. So for ith observation, we have a p-dimensional feature vector and one single number as the output level. And our what is our goal is that we have to find these weights w and the bias such that uh, our stated model, it can make on average predictions that best fit the observed output in the data. For the entire data set, we can represent this model. See, y hat is now represents the prediction for the entire data set in many predictions, which we can write it as xw plus b, or we can just merge that b along with the weight vector, assigning an additional column to this design matrix x. So we will have xw and all our desired parameters into this weight vector w. So our task is to just find the suitable parameters, the parameter values or the suitable value of this weight vector. So obviously, as we said, that we want to find these weight vectors such that it models the data, it fits the data. And whenever we are talking about fitting, we should have some measure of fitness. Only then we can say that it gives a good fit. And measure of fitness is expressed in terms of a loss function. Loss function quantifies the distance between real and predicted value of the target. So whenever someone is constructing a loss function, it has to keep two things in mind. First is the loss should be non-negative. I mean, there shouldn't be like a negative or positive loss, this sort of thing in linear when we're talking about in terms of linear regression. And second thing is the loss should be smaller whenever the fit is better. And when the fit is perfect or the prediction is perfect, the loss is zero. These two things has to be kept in mind. For linear regression, there are a number of possible loss functions one can use. We first have a look at what is the loss of prediction, loss in prediction from the ith observation. Like if we denote the observed output by yi and yi had the predicted output, then a squared error loss, we all know what will be the squared loss. Then there is Huber's loss or log cos h type of loss functions. Squared loss is most popular because it offers a very it is differentiable, and you will see we all know why squared loss is preferred, because we whenever we are optimizing the loss function, there is a closed form expression. So this is the loss we can find from the prediction of the ith observation. Obviously, we have to consider the loss from all the predicting all the observations in the data set. So the overall loss is the average of these individual loss functions. Is there... Oh, yes.
Yeah. So in the last slide, which you just had on the screen,
Mhm.
displaying the loss functions,
Yeah.
again, I had a curious question. This one only. So, like, I wanted to understand the intuition behind the losses. Like, I'll give an example. For the squared loss, it is like every loss, like, separate. The deviation from the prediction that is sort of uniformly being penalized.
Right.
Huber's loss seems to be like if the deviation is within a threshold, I am giving it some special treatment, and if it is greater than that, I'm giving it some special. But what about log cos h? Like, how do I intuitively understand why this kind of loss function is used?
These type of loss functions are actually used whenever you want to control the scale. I mean, like, see, it actually depends on yi and yi hat are on which scale, and what type of penalty you want to put accordingly. In that case, it is used.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So, given that we choose one loss function, we now we have a loss function, and then all we need to do is we just have to find that value of the parameter vector at which the loss is minimized. Square error loss, easy question because we have a closed form expression, not always, but mostly in special cases we have the closed form expression. But for other loss function, there are no closed form expression. And when there is no closed form expression, it could be that it is differentiable, but we are not being able to equate it to zero and find a closed form expression. In such cases, the solution is to go for the gradient descent method. Gradient descent is an iterative method that is very widely used when one wants to find the minimum of a function. And it is very widely used in machine learning to optimize most loss functions, complex loss functions. So the method is very simple. You have a function f, and at some iteration step you are standing somewhere, and you will move in that direction, in that opposite direction of the steepest ascent of the function. See, for in this diagram, you can see where the minimum is. It's like around 2. So at step 1, you are at this red line position. The steepest ascent is on the right side. So you move to the opposite direction, which is on the left side, to reach step 2. Again, from here, the steepest ascent is on the right side. So you move to the left side to step 3. Similar thing happens at step 3. You move further left to step 4, suppose. Then from step 4, you see there is a steepest ascent is on the left side, so you must move to the right side. And suppose you reach step 5 in this fashion. So if at x, so if you are at ith iteration, you are at step xi, then at I plus 1th iteration, it is xi minus to the negative of the gradient times, and eta is the learning rate. It basically controls the length of the step you are taking. If you take a small eta, that means you will take a small step. Larger eta means a larger step. So this is the actual idea of gradient descent, to be put in simple words. And luckily Python has commands where you don't have to even find this gradient by yourself. You just have to supply the loss function and it will automatically compute the gradient for you. But there are two problems with the gradient descent algorithm. One is that not all loss function has a global minima. There could be multiple minimas. And if our starting value is somewhat close to a local minima, our gradient descent algorithm can converge to that local minima. This is one of the major issues. Second issue is, see, for each update, we have to run it. You have to find the gradient at all the data points, and then you can update it to the from one iteration to the next. You can see the gradient of LW. If we write it, then it is actually the gradient of each of these individual, the gradient of the loss function, individual loss functions. So this will take time if your data set is large. So the solution for these two issues is to go for mini-batch stochastic gradient descent. Now for mini-batch stochastic gradient descent, the mathematics remains same, just there is one additional step. At each iteration, you just randomly sample from the data set a mini-batch of size, say B. B is a hyperparameter. It is decided beforehand, or maybe there is some hyperparameter tuning you can do. But this is a hyperparameter. You decide the size. You take a mini batch of size B, then you compute the gradient or individual gradient at those points that are in the mini batch or at those data points, and then take the average loss on that mini batch and update the model parameter based on that. So for at each iteration, I don't have to find the gradient at all endpoints, but at some B number of points, I have to run the gradient, find the gradient to update the parameter at each iteration. So it's very clear, it is memory efficient. You can decide the batch size by yourself. And second advantage is that, see, at every iteration there is a randomness, and with this randomness, it introduces a noise, because of which helps the algorithm to escape the local minima problem. It's highly likely that it will get stuck at the local minima. The update happening at each step will be very erratic if we do it from if we take a random sample of mini batch and run it on that. So this is the main idea of stochastic gradient descent. And a small note is that if the batch size is B, mini batch size is B is 1, that means we take one data point, select one data point randomly and update the parameter values based on the gradient of that point, then it's called a pure stochastic gradient descent. This method is obviously more memory efficient compared to mini batch when B is bigger than 1, but its convergence is really slow. Now, how can we represent it as a neural network? To do that, let us just have a look what we mean by neural network. Neural network is a type of machine learning model that is inspired from the functioning of a human brain. human brain has lots of neurons. It's a connection of neurons. What each neuron does is it receives some signals, processes it, generates a signal, passes on to the next neuron. Then that neuron gets activated, do the same thing, passes another signal to the next one. And this is how we actually process everything: thought, anger, anxiety, everything. So, and artificial neural network tries to mimic this process. It consists of layers of interconnected nodes. As you can see in this diagram, see the first layer, it sends up signal to the second layer. Then, then this second layer gets activated after receiving the signals. It processes it, then generates another signal to this third layer, which then gets activated, and then it generates a signal. This process goes on over layers until we reach the output layer. This is the very rough idea of a neural network structure, but it is very similar to the how the structure of our neurons in our brain. Linear regression can also be represented as such a neural network. Here we have p input variables, which we can represent with p nodes. Sorry, this will be xp, not x3, x1, x2, up to xp. P many nodes in the input layer, and the output here is the weighted sum. So we can just directly point them to the output layer as the weighted sum. So this is called a single layer neural network, where we don't have anything as a hidden layer. The very simple structure, and probably the simplest one to represent a neural network. Now moving on to the other regression model, which is softmax regression. This is quite popular for classification problem. Here the input is same, p-dimensional vector. Output is one of the categories C1, C2, Ck. Our target is we want to predict, given the input, what will be the category. Now, predicting an exact category, which is the hard assignment of categories, it cannot be appropriately modeled. We will see why. So what we try to do is we model the probability of occurrence of each class. I mean, given the output, we just want to find. So now our input is x1, x2, xp, and output is a k-dimensional vector. If there are k categories in the class, then it will be a k-dimensional vector or output. P1, P2, Pk, and Pi is actually the probability of occurrence of class Ci given X. It is similar to linear regression in the sense that it assigns a linear association between the input and output. Now, if I just say a linear association between input and output at this point, then if we follow the linear regression concept, it will mean that we can represent P1 as the weighted sum, P2 as weighted sum. Obviously, the weights are different. That's why there is a second subscript now with the weights. We can directly represent as linear sum. But this will not be appropriate. Obviously, because now P1, P2, they are probabilities, and there is no guarantee that given that if we don't assign any sort of constants on anything, then this weighted sum can be negative, it can be larger than 1, and there is also no guarantee that the P1s, Pi's will sum up to 1. But if it's a conditional probabilities, if it's an entire set of probabilities, obviously we will want that it should have satisfy all the axioms of probability, which is not the case. So instead of modeling the probabilities directly, we model what softmax regression does. It models something else, some other output, as the weighted sum of the input features, and then transforms these outputs to conditional probabilities. Let us call these outputs as O1, O2, OK now, not P1, P2, Pk, which are the weighted averages of the input variables. And then we exponentiate it so that it's non-negative, and then just normalization. So that makes sure that it is between 0 and 1 and sums up to 1. And this is known as the softmax operation. Now with this operation, it ensures that the PJs are non-negative and they will sum up to 1. And these output that what we actually model as the linear function of the x's, these outputs, they are called the logit. That's why this model is addressed as the logit model in statistics. Again, for this model, we can represent it as a neural network. Here, in the input layer remains same, x1, x2, xp nodes, but in the output layer, now we have k many nodes. And each of these nodes, they are actually function of all the inputs x1, x2, xp. That's why you can see they all like there is arrows pointing towards each from all the input layer nodes to the output O1, O2, and OK, because they are function of all of them, but different functions. So the setup is that our observed output, which we observe in our data set, y is equal to ci for some I in some class we observe. But if we do a one-hot encoding is basically just numerically vectorizing it, the categories. So if there are k categories, we will assign a k cross one dimensional vector. And if it's ci, then we'll have a 1 at the ith place and rest of them will be zeros. And our predicted output, they are conditional probabilities, P1, P2, Pk. Now, if we just look at the observed output and predicted output, you can see they are actually similar things. You can represent this one-hot encoding thing as actually a discrete probability distribution on this k outcomes. And so is the predicted output. This is also a probability distribution. So here you can look at the, now you can look at the output variable as some probability distributions. The modeling or the vector notations are very similar to what we have done in linear regression, just that previously we have for each observation numerical value yi. Now we can represent it as a vector of values, k vector values. And so our weights, there we had a weight vector, now we have a weight parameter. For each oi, we have one vector wi. We can represent it in this way. And I have also added the bias in this weight vector by using just an additional row of b1, b2, bk to denote the vectors. And obviously there will be an additional column in the design matrix of ones to represent the bias. So this is the overall model to represent the predictions for the entire logic predictions for the entire data set. O is equal to xw. So now instead of a weight vector, we have a weight matrix compared to linear regression. Now comes to choosing the loss function. The most widely used loss function is the log likelihood loss. How do we find it? So for ith observation, we have an input vector, and in output, we have a one-hot label vector. This is the observed output yi, and the predicted conditional probability is yi hat. I was using P1, P2, Pk there. So now it's for yi, it will be Pi1, Pi2, Pik. And just to match it as an estimate of yi, I am also using this notation yi1 hat to up to yik hat. So the for likelihood for the ith example will be then this conditional probability, which will be like the probability to the power number of times it has occurred in the data set. That will be the likelihood of that observing that data, which will be yi hat to the power yj hat, product over all the classes. So if yi was actually C1 category, if in the ith observation it was category 1, then obviously the likelihood of the data will be yi hat 1. So this is the likelihood of the ith data set, ith observation, and so the likelihood of the entire data set will be the product of these conditional probabilities. So now in loss function, but for loss function, it is actually the opposite of likelihood. For likelihood, we want to maximize the likelihood. For loss function, we have a minimization problem. So maximizing the likelihood is similar to minimizing the negative of log likelihood. That's why we can represent the loss function as the negative of the log likelihood. Just simply put, if we take a logarithm, then the expression just basically simplifies to this quantity yij times log yij hat summed over all the classes and over all the observations. And if we just put the exact value for yij hat, which is actually the softmax operation of the logit, then we can represent this log likelihood in terms of the model parameters, and we can call it as a function of the parameter vector w. And so now our purpose is simple. We just want to minimize this loss function. But remember, in linear regression, what we did was that we found the loss from the individual observations, like what is the loss of prediction in the ith observation. And then what we did was we just averaged over all the losses. But here also we can have a similar representation. See, LW can be represented as average of these losses, which is summing over all the categories Yij log Yij hat. This is the loss from the ith observation if we represent the loss function as average losses, average of individual losses. This expression is very popular in information theory as the cross entropy loss. Now, to understand what is a cross entropy loss or how this quantity here actually represents a loss of prediction, we need to understand what is an entropy first. Now, entropy of a distribution actually quantifies the information content of the data that is generated by that distribution. Just a second. Just 1 minute. There are some notational problems. Yeah. So, as I was saying, so the formula for the entropy of a distribution is given in this way: summation I minus summation I pi log pi. So this pi is actually the probability of the ith outcome. This is a discrete probability distribution. Maybe there are k or some specific number of outcomes. The pi is the probability of ith outcome. And minus log pi, it actually contains the information content or surprisal. See how we can interpret it. Whenever pi is close to 1, that means an event is that means the ith outcome is very less is very likely. Whenever an outcome is very likely, so occurrence of that outcome is not very surprising. The amount of surprise is very low, and so see the negative log pi, it is close to 0. And when pi is close to 0, that event is very less likely. So when that event occurs, it's very surprising. It carries a very high amount of surprise in that event. So minus log pi, it goes to infinity. So this minus log pi is a quantity that quantifies the amount of surprise. The more surprising it is, the more information it carries. And so you see that this quantity here, if you just then look at minus log pi as some function of the outcome, then the entropy is actually a measure of expected surprisal one can have from expected surprisal one can have if one observes data from this distribution. That means given this distribution, uh, the observer have an outcome. Now that corresponding to that outcome, one can compute this amount minus log pi if he knows the distribution as the information content of that data. So that's why what will be the average information content if he observes data from this distribution, that is quantified by the formula or by this quantity called entropy. This is the concept of entropy. Next comes cross entropy. Cross entropy is very close but just a little different. In cross entropy, one believes that I am observing data from the distribution Q. So, whatever data he is observing, he will be calculating the amount of surprise using the distribution Q, believing that it has come from Q, when the data is actually coming from a different distribution P. So, you see that he has an observation, he will calculate the outcome, the surprise in that outcome as minus log Qj, because he believes that it is coming from the distribution Q, but it is actually coming from P. So it is actually the expected surprisal of the observer with subjective probabilities from Q, where when the data actually is generated from the distribution P. It is like a measure of difference between the two distributions P and Q as well. In our case, if we look at now, what do we believe? That our data is from the predicted set of probabilities, which is Q. This is from where we believe that our ith observation is coming from, when its true distribution is actually the one hot level encoded vector yi p. So if we compute the cross entropy here, it will be you see, it will be the same thing that we saw in the log likelihood expression. So as you can see, the cross entropy loss and the log likelihood loss, they are actually same. So we can choosing either of them makes, it will give us the same parameter vector. So now once we have decided our loss functions, we can find the parameter, not vector, parameter matrix using the gradient descent method, or if the data set is too large, we can use a stochastic gradient descent, and that will give us the conditional probability of occurring of the categories, but that will be soft assignment of classes. And but there are some examples where hard assignment of classes becomes very essential. So in that case, that means you have to decide a particular class as the output. In that case, what we can do is we can just choose that category as the predicted category which has the maximum probability of occurrence. So it is max. So we can, if we denote that particular category by zi hat, then it is actually the J class for which this yij hat is maximum. So in that case, we also have measure of fitness. In this way, we have a set of predicted class, and then we observe some actual class, and we can actually find a measure of fitness in terms of accuracy as the number of, or the proportion of correctly predicted examples. That means in all those i's where the predicted class and the actual predicted class. So it's not actual predicted class, but actual observed class. It will be, so the actual observed class and predicted class, they are same. This is the most basic measure of fitness. There are actually a number of measures of fitness in this aspect that actually depends on our purpose of classification. Like if it's a binary classification, you have a number of skill scores like accuracy, besides that probability of detection, false alarm rate. Depends on the application, but this is the most basic measure of fitness when it comes to hard assignment of category. So with this, I complete the softmax regression modeling, and that will be all from my side. Questions, if there is any?